Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you for all you've already done participating in Climate Sunday. I'm Andy Atkins. My day job is Chief Exec of Roche UK, but I've also had the great pleasure and privilege of chairing this campaign through the year with many of the people here on this Zoom tonight acting as steering committee. We wanted, as a steering committee, to give you very rapid feedback after this momentous event that's happened in the UK. It's not the end of the campaign, but it's a key moment. Obviously, we want to leave a legacy long after COP, but COP has been a big focus for our campaign. So before I hand over to different members of the steering committee who will report on different aspects of what we experienced at COP and the outcomes of it, let me just explain a little bit about how COP works, because it'll make sense then in the presentations you get. And there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. So please do use the question and answer function that you should see at the bottom of your screen. Do tap in your questions there, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during 15-20 minutes at the end of this. Okay. So very briefly, what exactly is COP and how does it work? Well, at the heart of COP is an intergovernmental negotiation, as they say. It is a negotiation between the governments of the world within a UN framework, within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to be precise, a treaty that dates from 1992, from the Rio summit, for those of you who remember that far back. So at the heart, physically and politically, of COP is the so-called blue zone. It's the high security, very restricted access zone where the politicians and the delegates from countries meet to negotiate. And partly because we were part of a Russia International observer team, Hannah Eves here on the call and myself had passes to the blue zone. So Hannah will report back on the political outcomes, the official business of COP. Also, over time, however, COP has developed a number of other aspects, and one of them is the civil society zone, as it's called, and it was called the green zone this time at COP. It's within the security perimeter of COP, but it's much more easy access and the public can get into it. And that's where we had our Climate Sunday exhibition, and many people came to that, we're pleased to say. So Gethin Rees from Churches Together in Wales will report back on that, but many others here on the call were very involved in that, but Gethin will report back on that. Then beyond the green zone, beyond the campus of COP, you also have throughout the city of Glasgow and even further afield, many organizations organizing side events. It's a bit like the Edinburgh Fringe. And yes, I know we're in Glasgow. I'm not doing a Boris. We were in Glasgow, but you know what I mean. It's lots of things happening throughout the city. And Stephen Curran here, from Eco Congregation Scotland, was actually the manager of one of those venues. Steve will come at the end to talk about where we go next, but there were a multitude of events happening. And then, of course, there were many Christian and faith events in particular, and there was the big civil society rally on the middle weekend, which was sort of happening throughout the city. It was, you know, a rally, there were many pilgrimages arriving and so on. So Maria Elena from CAFOD we'll talk about the faith's contribution in particular, that march and so on. We've also got on the call Miranda and Caroline, both from the steering committee, who can come in on questions as well. Caroline from Climate Stewards, Miranda from Diocese of Oxford, among other things. So do you know, be aware there are others here who can answer questions if you want. Okay, so that's how COP actually works. So let's now hear back from different aspects of that. And I'll ask Hannah, my colleague from Russia UK, to come in and just report briefly on the political outcomes, what actually was achieved and agreed. Hannah.
Thank you. Hi. So yeah, over the last year at Climate Sunday, we've been encouraging you as churches and participants to speak up, to tell the government that we want a greener and fairer future. We did this because we felt that it was important for the church to show that we care about what happens at COP26 and that these decisions matter, and they should matter, because what happened in Glasgow affects all of us, which is why I'm going to give you just a brief overview of some of the key things that were agreed. First of all, it's important to bear in mind that COP actually failed to deliver on two of the most important objectives of the conference. The first was achieving a level of greenhouse gas emission pledges, which would equate to keeping global temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial average. The second one was delivering on the past promise to provide 100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries go green and adapt to climate change. These are both very significant. We know that with every degree of warming, there will be bigger and more devastating impacts to communities across the world, often the communities least equipped to handle them, who have done the least to cause it. And to not even deliver on the previously promised financing was indeed in many ways disappointing. The general consensus coming out of COP is that the 1.5 degree target is on life support. What was agreed at COP does not guarantee that we will keep the temperature close to that figure. However, at the same time as that, it's important to bear in mind that the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is the text that we left Glasgow with, is something that we can build on and does move in the right direction on both of these issues. Significantly, the pact requests countries update their current and inadequate emission cuts pledges to bring them in line with 1.5 and commits them to considering the adequacy of these aggregated pledges at COP26 next year in Egypt, rather than in 5 years' time, which was what was originally agreed at Paris. The pact also promises a meeting of ministers in the year ahead to try and achieve these long-promised climate finance flows, whilst also acknowledging that developing countries already need much more than the originally promised finance amounts. Given that the UK remains the COP hosts, stewards of this agreement all the way up through to Egypt next year, they are responsible for implementing these changes. And this means that as part of civil society here in the UK, we have a significant leverage actually in the next year to put pressure on them to do this. Another positive thing to come out of the Glasgow Climate Pact is that actually this is the first COP text to name fossil fuels and the need to get the global economy off them. This is the first text, even though they are the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions. Such has been the power of the fossil fuel lobby for so long. But this time, the prime culprit, the fossil fuels, is spotlighted, and the text does call for a phase down of coal, which is the most climate damaging of all, and an end to inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So even the mention of coal, fossil fuels and subsidies breaks that long taboo, which opens the way for more discussion and more action. Also significant at COP was the recognition that addressing climate change will require us to protect the world's remaining forests and other carbon sinks found in nature, such as wetlands and grasslands, and restore these at scale. There was an agreement early in the conference on ending deforestation, which was signed by over 120 nations. And whilst a roadmap for implementing this is lacking, there is an intention to act on this. So we have some positives as well as some disappointments. So what happens now with the COP decisions? Well, the lack of decisive breakthroughs on critical issues of finance and emission cuts, coupled with that agreement to come back in 2022, adds pressure on wealthier nations such as the UK and to give a greater priority to domestic climate policy and action in the year ahead. And that underscores the critical importance of maintaining and growing public pressure for that change. The build up to COP felt huge. I'm sure it felt huge to you. People were talking about it as the final opportunity to take life-saving action on the climate. This is the moment. If we don't act now, it's too late. This is our last chance. And while that urgency is true, ultimately, we know that the success and failure of COP26 will depend on what happens next. Governments and civil society could use the opportunities in the Glasgow Climate Pact, those building blocks I've described, to accelerate actions to address climate change in the year ahead. Or, as happens many times, other interests could keep pushing it further back with all hope of keeping global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 dead. Well, this is where we come in.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks. It's stark and clear. Some not very happy parts to the ending of COP, but some things we can really and must build on. Thanks for that. I'll go over now, if I may, to Maria Elena from CAFOD to talk about what happened more generally with faiths. And then I'll go over to Gethin to talk about the Climate Sunday stall.
Well, hello, everyone. It was my great pleasure. Oh. Is that better? It's always good to have the microphone where you can hear it. It was wonderful to spend kind of about 10 days at the COP. I didn't stay for the end, but I wasn't kind of in the negotiations. I was much more in the kind of faith and civil society spaces. And for me, the two biggest times were the 2 weekends. And there were a number of really exciting faith events on the weekends. The first weekend, there were climate pilgrims that who arrived internationally and across the UK, and they all kind of came into the city and had a kind of welcome procession, and also services to kind of welcome them kind of on the Friday and Saturday, and they were very inspirational. On the Sunday, there was a Talanoa interfaith dialogue at the Garnet Hill Synagogue, which was very powerful, with partners kind of and people from across the world, kind of including indigenous peoples, including, you know, there was a wonderful Episcopalian priest from the Pacific Islands talking about, you know, who, you know, are you my neighbor? And just that kind of question to the audience was incredibly powerful. During the week, there are all kinds of events, as well as the stall that Gethin will talk about on Monday, the 1st of November. On the 2nd of November, there was a wonderful kind of service that was a hand-in of all the faith actions and petitions, and you know, including Climate Sunday, that were kind of handed over to the COP president. Unfortunately, he didn't attend, but he did kind of send or a message came from one of his deputies, which was something. But then the big weekend, the middle weekend, the march, the climate march, which started in Kelvin Grove Park, and it was wonderful that, you know, there were over 100,000 people in London. So if you were in London, that was brilliant. I know of many others that were in Manchester, in Derby, you know, there were a dozen other places across the country that also had events and marches. But the event in Glasgow was really key, and certainly it felt as if, you know, we were heard. Over 120,000 people. I have to say it was hard work. We were 2 hours in the rain. The faith block was the last block that entered the march, and so we were 2 hours waiting in a very soggy part of Kelvin Grove Park in the very pouring rain. So I have to say that it was lovely to be with people who are all kind of wanting the same things, and that part of it was good. But it was a lot of standing around in a very wet cold, and then walking through the city. But, you know, people were shouting, people were singing hymns. It was really a very inspirational, if hard, time for those of us that aren't the best at walking. And it was quite a long march, over 5 miles from Kelvin Grove Park to Glasgow Green. And of course, by the time we got there were, you know, that all the speeches had finished. But still, I think it was a really important message. And I think it was actually, you know, it was recognized by people, you know, official people who were in the blue zone official spaces, that this huge event happened with people from across the UK. So I think that was all of these these moments that were kind of ecumenical and interfaith were very powerful. There was also the first weekend, a wonderful kind of interfaith outside prayer moment on the Sunday, the 7th. There was a big delegates Catholic Mass, and there was also a big official ecumenical service at St. Mungo's, which was really beautiful, amazing music, and a lot of the you know, official delegations, well, including the Vatican. Cardinal Parolin was there amongst many others. So really, you know, it really felt as if the faiths and the churches were very much in Glasgow during the whole time of the COP. I even knew of a few religious sisters who went and didn't particularly go to any events, but were there praying for a successful outcome. And of course, you know, one could say that not as much as we wanted to, but I think we need to recognise the COP as a process, and we need to carry on. The UK still has the presidency. Anyway, now I'll hand over to Gethin, who will speak about the Climate Sunday Day on the 1st of November.
Thanks, Maria Elena. Gethin, to you.
Thank you. And I hope you can now see more than me, but some other better known people on the screen. So on that very first day of COP, the 1st of November, we were in the green zone, which, as Andy explained earlier, was the civil society zone, specifically as Climate Sunday. Now, Joe Biden didn't actually come to the stall. I'm sorry about that. I've got his picture up because we did have a live feed from the blue zone. So in the few quiet moments we had, we were able to go and see what was happening in the main conference. And so everyone else in the green zone could. And that was true throughout the fortnight when there were plenary sessions going on, that people could follow them. The rest of the time on the main screen and throughout the 12 days on the digital green zone, which was available throughout the world, there were videos that have been sent in by various civil society organizations from around the world. But I have to tell you, the Climate Sunday videos seem to keep coming around every two hours or so. So those of you who sent in footage and so forth, it wasn't just seen on our stall for one day, it was seen throughout the world for 12 days. And so thank you very, very much to people who sent in video footage. I've got two of the clips there. One is Hannah Brown from the Joint Public Issues team explaining about Climate Sunday. The other is a clip from part of the worship that was filmed by the Diocese of Oxford. There were many, many other contributions, not room for them all on this slide. So that contributed to the whole of the 12 days at COP. Anyone who came into the green zone when there wasn't a plenary on saw that video coming around. Anyone who logged on around the world saw it. So thank you. On the stall itself on the 1st of November, we were also able to include additional material on the screen. On the picture, you can see Amanda McQuashie from Christian Aid. There were many other people including people, simply ordinary members of local churches explaining the commitments that they had made. And people stopped and they commented. If they recognized themselves, of course, they were delighted, or recognized people that they knew. But they were also really amazed at the whole range of things that churches had done. And we had a document on the stall naming all the 2,200 churches who'd registered their Climate Sunday service. Some people took copies of that away. We know that there were far more than 2,200 services, but some were registered by one church on behalf of a group. We, of course, only have the name of the church that registered. And some, I suspect, well, not I suspect, I know, because it's true of my own church, actually forgot to register. So there were more than 2,200 churches, but we could name that number, and people were impressed. We do hope, by the way, after COP, and we'll say a bit more about this later, to make as much of that material as is possible available online for people who missed COP to see, both the written material and the video and picture material. When we arrived on the Sunday to set up our stall, we were treated, I have to say, rather embarrassingly, as absolute stars by our neighbours. Now, the neighbouring stall, obviously we had no say in who happened to be on the next stall, but it turned out to be the Republic of Palau. I'm sure you've all heard of the Republic of Palau, but I hadn't, and I had to both ask them and then go and look at an atlas in the flat where I was staying to be entirely certain. Palau is a group of 500 islands in the Pacific. Indonesia is to the west, and Melanesia is to the east, and Palau is in the middle. They cover a large amount of ocean, 500 islands, not much land, and a total population of just under 18,000. Now, I'm from Wales, and we like to think of ourselves as a small nation with just 3 million people. They're a small nation with fewer than 18,000, but they're a really important nation because their territorial waters include some very, very sensitive parts of the Pacific Ocean. And their stall told the story of how they are seeking to protect their part of the ocean in the face of ocean acidification, but also, of course, in the face of rising sea levels. I've therefore started to take an interest in Palau. Since meeting these wonderful people. By the way, they treated us like heroes, I said. That was because in their schools, their children were doing a project on Climate Sunday. So although some churches in Britain and Ireland never got to hear of it, the churches in Palau did and the schools in Palau did. Obviously, teachers must have Googled what are churches in the United Kingdom doing and had come up with Climate Sunday. And it was their project. And I got to speak to the daughter of the lady you can see in the picture by WhatsApp. She was rather shy, being a child talking to a stranger, but she had been doing a project on Climate Sunday, and her mother was so excited that she was talking to someone who'd actually been involved in this project, which was wonderful. The following day, the president of Palau got to speak at the conference, as each president had in turn, and he said this: "There is no dignity in a slow and painful death. You might as well bomb our islands as leave us to die slowly. Because like all the Pacific Islands, they are facing a future as sea levels rise, which is one in the end of extinction of their islands." And being next door to Palau couldn't have been a better place, both because they were absolutely lovely people and so nice to us, but also because they reminded us so vividly and clearly of what we are fighting for on this earth and what Climate Sunday is committing us to do. And then in the final session, as I say, I'm now fascinated by Palau. I've committed that for as long as the climate crisis lasts, which means for the rest of my life, I will pray every day for the people of Palau, having met a good number of them on the stall. On the very final day, when, as Hannah described, some of the promises were a bit disappointing, to put it mildly, the representative of Palau said that as that session was going on, as people were voting to water down some of the resolutions, there were floods happening in Palau as a direct result of rising sea levels. And so she voted for that agreement reluctantly, while people in her homeland, she could see them on the web, were having their homes flooded. So it was a privilege to be next door to people in Palau for that one day. And at least in my prayers, my intention is to be next door to them from now on. Thank you.
Thanks, Gethin. Very, very moving. And I think for others of us who were there, as Gethin says, it was like, you know, here we are in the UK, relatively comfortable. You couldn't really compute what our neighbours in the stall were going through. Quite extraordinary experience. And I move now last, and then we'll open up to questions to Stephen. So Stephen is from Eco Congregation of Scotland, also been a member of the steering committee. Stephen, as I said, was actually hosting one of those many venues out in the Glasgow Fringe. But Stephen's going to take us through some ideas on where we go next as churches and Christians post COP. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's a great privilege to be with so many wonderful partners again, which has been the great success for Climate Sunday's initiative of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, is bringing together so many churches, denominations, charities, organisations all across Britain and Ireland with a clear focus on worship, committing to, as a local church community, but also speaking up for political action as well from our leaders. So I'm delighted also to be speaking to you from Glasgow, the proud host city of COP26, recovering host city. They're slowly dismantling the Blue Zone, the Scottish Events Campus, but it was wonderful for us to welcome the world online, and some of you even in person, to Glasgow for this extremely important staging post in tackling climate change. Just to remind everybody what the churches, those 2,200 registered and more, as Gethin explained, had agreed to be part of this wonderful project over the past year or two. By committing to worship, it was about holding a climate-focused service to explore theological and scientific basis of creation care and action in climate, to pray and to commit to action. And we had wonderful resources across a whole ranges of different types of worship, different types of expression of church. And it's really significant to say that was still happening even during COP. There were churches in Glasgow were holding Climate Sunday services. So COP wasn't just the end of the process. I think it's been a real opening for churches to see that this is something that's part of mainstream worship. So we'd like to encourage you to think about that further, not just about season of creation, which is important, or even during Advent, which a lot of the churches are celebrating, but the lectionary really focuses on readings that point towards the action we need to take as people of faith in climate. But actually thinking about that as part of your prayer, your worship, as your life as a church, and worship on a Sunday and throughout the course of the year, in terms of holding services that really focus on the climate and nature loss, the ecological and climate crises that we're facing. Making a commitment as a local church community is a really important aspect too. Taking long-term action to reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions. Now, obviously, we've been delighted to have a Rosh's Eco Church, CAFOS Live Simply across England and Wales, Eco Congregation Ireland supporting churches all across the island of Ireland and committing as local church communities to environmental activities, and of course ourselves in Scotland, working with all sorts of churches from Shetland down to the Solway Firth in relation to commitment to care and act for creation. Now, those programmes are there for people to continue to register, but also think about what you can do next, looking at how you reduce your carbon footprint as a church community and as a wider community, and looking at our awards programmes to take that action further, to be recognised as leaders and people who can share best practice in our communities. So that commitment is something which continues, which all the churches who registered are able to take further as part of what we commit to across the nations in relation to our own commitment towards a net zero world and our own nations as part of that. And the Speak Up action finally has been really significant. And churches were the strongest voices amongst the faith communities, and the faith communities were the strongest voices amongst wider civil society in relation to really using our voices to tell political leaders that we want a cleaner, greener, fairer future at the heart of plans to rebuild our economy through the coronavirus and climate crises. Obviously, we had a significant contribution to the Climate Coalition's The Time Is Now declaration, both as churches and as individuals, but that was something which was able to be signed across the nations. And we've got an added bonus in relation to the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland focus, in that it's not just the Climate Coalition, but also Stop Climate Chaos Cymru, Stop Climate Chaos across Ireland, Climate Coalition in Northern Ireland, and obviously Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, which we are part of as well, where we can also make representations at different levels of government, particularly through devolution or through the Dáil in Ireland, and obviously the UK Parliament for those of us in the United Kingdom. And today we were lucky to even see the first steps of this with the Climate Coalition asking us all to sign a petition for our members of Parliament to make sure that action is taken now as the next steps from COP for the first 100 days after COP, for all members of Parliament to ask the Prime Minister as a reminder that we need to lead for this coming year, as Hannah explained earlier, in relation to COP, also as commitments we can make in our own communities. So we've got a lot of work still to do. Climate Sunday's been fantastic at bringing us all together to support each other, but also to support the wider communities we all are part of across Britain and Ireland. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, folk, we have plenty of time for questions, and thanks to my colleagues from the steering group for very succinct and great presentations there. Before I just open up to questions, I think it's worth just reminding people that this is just a very quick, almost like intuitive feedback from last week. It's very recent. Some of us are still sleeping hours just to catch up and so on. We will have on the 20th of January, a couple of months away now, a much more structured and comprehensive look together as what we can do next as Climate Sunday. And we will be bringing a number of worked out ideas to you, as well as information about what we do with all the assets on the website and so on. So this isn't the last time you hear from us, far from it. There'll be a, look out for details of that seminar on the webinar on the 20th of January, by which time we'll be able to give you a much more comprehensive package of where we can go next. Okay, but for now, the floor is open. Please do put questions into the Q&A. I will, and if you have somebody in particular you want to address them, please do. Otherwise, I'll sort of try and guess here. The first one is more of a statement, I think, not a question, but Chris Packham is pretty depressed about the lack of right actions and decisions. Personally, I'm feeling depressed. What can we do next? Well, I mean, Stephen has said something about that. I wonder if I can just add something personally, and it's this, that I think we really need to grasp the significance of this next year. And whilst I think, as Stephen has said, we all need as churches to implement whatever commitments we have taken as part of Climate Sunday, to go further with eco-congregation or whatever we have decided. I think the emphasis on campaigning comes to the fore now. It's absolutely vital that our government hears what wider civil society expects of them. And if I name just one thing, for example, that could be really positive or really negative. When there was such celebration, as Hannah said, that the words fossil fuel and coal and subsidies got into the COP text for the first time ever, despite the fact that science has shown for decades that they are the problem. If the British government goes ahead with new fossil fuel exploration now, which it is actually planning, what do we think that will do to British credibility to lead the rest of the world to implement these decisions? I just put that out there. I think there's some fairly obvious things we need to be saying as Christians to our leadership. Do not even think of going there. That would be abhorrent to us. That would be completely disastrous for your leadership of the world at this critical time. There are other things we could mention, but that's one that stands out to me. So I think we need to be really clear what the big issues are and tell government what we want them to do about them. That's a personal opinion. That's not, I can't speak for the whole steering committee, but that's an example of where I think we just need laser-like focus on the big issues in speaking up to government, in writing to our MPs, and until we get the answer we want. Personal opinion. Will Climate Sunday be an annual event? Would somebody else like to answer that one? Just say what we have thought so far. I can think Gethin, Stephen, Miranda, anybody on the steering committee, do come in.
Shall I quickly, Andy, and say that Climate Sunday was set up as a time-limited coalition, as these coalitions normally are. The reason being that to get a whole range, 30+ organisations, plus some of which are umbrellas, so more than that, to commit to, as it turned out, 2 years of joint action, and to set to one side to some extent their own programmes and priorities, is a tough ask in itself. To make it permanent would be asking even more. But we do intend, as Andy's already said, to have that legacy on the website. So local churches who've been so core and key to this, of course, you can have an annual Climate Sunday, and we will make sure there are resources available. I can see there's lots of people from Wales on the call, so let me say that includes resources in Welsh as well as English.
Thanks, Gethin. Yes, as Gethin said, that is what we decided to start with. But the kind of anarchist in me says, if churches locally want to carry on with it, there's not a lot we can do about it, which is kind of what Gethin said, but just in different words. And we're very conscious, also things change. So we have got discussions planned as the steering committee as to what is the best way to facilitate churches continuing this this initiative, even though there may not be a formal coalition with the intensity we've had this year to drive it. And there are ways that we can think of. We'll feed all that back in January. Thanks, Gethin. That was bold of you to address that one, Gethin. So from Judith Morris, can somebody say more about the forest agreement? I mean, I think that's probably one for Hannah or for me. Hannah, do you want to attempt that?
Yeah, sure. So the agreement, this was in the first week of COP, and it was called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. And it was basically 120 and more countries agreed to halt deforestation, covering about 85% of the world's forests. And it was a pledge that included about 14 billion of public and private funds to help with this. So yeah, it's a pledge to stop the deforestation. Whether or not they will deliver on it is another question, because there was a similar pledge, which has been noted by environmentalists back in 2014, to halt deforestation by 2020, which didn't happen. So this is again where this kind of accountability in these next few stages come into play. And did you feel that covered it, or do you want to add anything on to that?
No, the only thing I'd add is that I think there is greater awareness this time. I was listening to a speech in the room with Zach Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith, who is of course the British minister most in charge of this area at COP, and he was recognizing that there was a failure to implement the last agreement, which was actually not in the climate conference. It was in, sorry, the agreement was not in the climate process. It was in the Millennium Development Goals, if you're familiar with that. So it dates from 2010, I think. And he was acknowledging there was a failure to implement those and basically saying, so what are we going to do differently? And the British government is actually working on some things which it hopes will mean that it's more likely it will be implemented this time. But that's another area where we absolutely have to keep up the pressure. I mean, for example, at a local issue to Russia, UK, the Ghanaian president signed that declaration, okay, to end deforestation. At the same time, we know they're planning to take the top off a mountain in Ghana with absolutely pristine rainforest with some of the rarest animals in the world in it. How is that consistent? We absolutely need to say to governments, you've signed that thing, don't wait 10 years to stop deforesting, it needs to start now, I would say. Okay, there's one here about faith leaders in the blue zone. Were there faith leaders in the blue zone and perhaps on country delegations? Were statements made by them? Maria Elena, I know you weren't in the blue zone, but you know a lot about what was going on there. Do you want to address that one? Yeah, you're on mute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I can say is that Pope Francis did send a statement that was read out by the head of the Vatican delegation, which is an official delegation, part of the 197 countries. So Cardinal Parolin read out a powerful statement on the Tuesday, I believe. And I mean, again, in it, he said all of the many things. There was a very big faith statement that was put together and by many number of faith leaders, including the Archbishop of Canterbury with Pope Francis and many others on the 4th of October. And that was the kind of statement to COP. But then he did also have an official statement that was read out by Cardinal Parolin. I'm not actually, certainly there were many kind of priests and religious who were part of that weren't part of official country delegations, but were part of the kind of NGOs that were allowed into the green zone. I mean, CAFOD had a number of passes into the blue zone, and many of them were used by our partners from Brazil, Colombia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, other like Kenya, and they not all of them were religious, and not all of them were they would have been kind of part of our church partners from across the world, and we weren't the only agency like that in the UK. So I know that there were a good number of people of faith speaking from their position of working with the communities in their countries about the impact of climate, and certainly as CAFOD, and I'm sure many of the other faith agencies who came to Glasgow across the UK were very much keen to be able to kind of to show both the UK government delegation, but many of the others, you know, to kind of share the expertise, the wisdom, the whole kind of reason why countries needed to act, and that was through all of those international voices.
Thanks, Maria Elena. Let me briefly take that question about how long is the Prime Minister head of COP, or is Britain head of COP? Yes, we remain legally under kind of UN procedures responsible for the delivery of those agreements until we hand over to Egypt in November next year at COP27, which will be in Sharm el-Sheikh, I believe, in Egypt. I'm expecting, though I don't know for certain, that Alok Sharma will remain as COP president. There's a big job to be done, but whoever the people involved are, the UK government, whoever that's led by as well, let me say, it remains responsible for the outcomes delivery in cooperation with the UN. The UN owns the process, but if you like, the UK needs to lead on the diplomacy around it for the next year. Is that right, Maria Elena?
Absolutely. The UK government has, yes, with Italy, but mainly the UK is still the president of COP. And there's actually lots of work to be done kind of now that the actual official meetings are over. And kind of all the way now through till June, there'll be other kind of important intercessional meetings where kind of people will, the kind of key negotiators will come together again. So, I mean, that won't be a public meeting, but that will be another key opportunity. So from now until then, the UK has a huge job to kind of keep driving the process forward. And I would say, you know, I did it today. Write to your MP, tell them that what's happened, tell them the UK needs to keep moving and to keep moving forward. You know, we can't say that COP was good or bad, but, you know, there was some movement, but things need to really get lined up to be able to carry on.
Thanks, Maria Elena. So the next question, really important one, I think, about, you know, what do we tell the young people who seem very, very disappointed? How can we help them process the outcomes of COP? I mean, I'm tempted to ask one of the younger people here, Hannah, can I drop you in that and say, from your perspective, what would help? What helps? I mean, I'm not making you have to be the spokesperson for every young person in the country, but you're the youngest on the you know, who's been involved in this at the steering group level.
Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah, so I mean, as we sort of said, I was in the Blue Zone for the 2 weeks, and I think there were moments hearing from Indigenous people, from experts, from people who've been in this space for a long time. It was really hard not to feel anxious and a bit, you know, that kind of climate grief and climate anxiety that you hear so much about. And something that actually was helpful for me was one of the moments I was really encouraged by a church service we went to at St. George's Tron, which is one of the churches that hosted a lot of events in which people kind of came together and worshipped and prayed and had time together and kind of was really encouraged. And I think it's a pastoral issue for us in churches who are Christians, who are in this space. For the young people, you know, that kind of pastoral element is really helpful, actually, in kind of remembering to do that. And I think also remembering that it's not just about the young people, it's also a little bit scary when everyone says it's all about the young people, they're the ones, you know, it's also the people in the middle and the older people. We all have a place in this and a role to play, and to kind of not always emphasize that is also something that I would feed back as a young person. As much as it's great to have a voice and have a platform, and I'm very grateful for that, remember it's not just about the young activists.
Thanks, Hannah. And I wonder too, having been involved since I was actually quite young, and I'm no longer, helping folk to understand the difference between what's going on, the different zones. You know, you can expend a huge amount of time in a march and you can feel this is fantastic, we've really raised our voice, and then it appears to have no impact on what's happened in the blue zone. Well, actually, it still has a value, but it probably never was going to affect the text on this occasion. But its value is to raise public awareness so that next time you get further faster, and helping people understand what the different elements of a COP do contribute, and not to get confused between the two, so that they don't feel so disappointed that all the effort they've made appears not to have led to the perfect outcome of a text. It never was going to. But it still has a huge value. And I think helping people to understand that, I hope, can help them understand this is a big process. It's not all dependent on governments. There's lots of different components we have to make happen. and therefore, you know, every commitment, every effort is worthwhile. That may or may not help young people, but that is what has helped me as I've got older to understand those differences. Let me move on. George, how well do you think we will do as a nation in having a just transition, ensuring that the poor here as well as abroad do not feel the cost more than others? This is what I want to press my MP about. This is really, I mean, it's a massive issue. I wonder if I can ask Stephen to come in on this. I'm picking on Stephen because Scotland as well, of course, has an oil industry and a gas industry. And they are going to be, you know, if we get off fossil fuel, what happens to them? So I know that you in Scotland have to think about this, and probably in Wales too, you know, much more. I know coal is almost gone in Wales, but not entirely. You know, so
yeah. Thank you to George. That's a really good question. One thing that's really interesting in the Scottish context is that just transition is actually part of our legislative answer towards reaching net zero by 2045. So there's been a commission looking at it before the Scottish Parliament elections this year, and it's been set up again for the full term of this Scottish Parliament, 5 years, to look at the differences that have to be made in relation to that. And obviously we've got history where the mining industry in other parts of these islands have been a particular problem with communities been desolated when those face closure. So there's something really important about just transition. It was also part of the compromise for the final COP deal when coal was going to be phased down rather than phased out. The just transition actually got in there. And some people saw that as negative. I would see it as something we can make into a positive, because it is about saying that the burden of climate change and addressing it through climate action isn't faced by the poor more than anybody else. There's got to be a hand up in terms of that process. So for me, it's really important, and George has asked a really significant question there. I think it's something for our MPs that they understand, because some communities have got a bigger impact that they are facing than others in relation to these changes. And obviously you mentioned the oil and gas industry, and in Scotland, we are facilitating conversations in those communities where that's a big part of the employment. And also there are other aspects of work around food production where there are vulnerabilities as well in Britain and Ireland. And having a conversation to say to people, what would you like to see happening? You want to address the climate emergency, but you also don't want to be the ones that are paying the price unfairly in this, is something that's really important. And churches have got a pastoral role, supporting people through that as much as a practical. Definitely, like you said earlier, a campaigning role to say, do more to the MPs, do more to the government in this year, and then on up to the next COP.
Thanks, Stephen. Gethin, I wonder if there's anything, would you add anything to that from Wales? I mean, we don't really have a fossil fuel industry left in England, but in Wales you still do, don't you?
Well, only on a very, very small scale. The Welsh government, in fact, was one of only 10 governments who joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance at COP. This was one of the smaller agreements. The rest of the UK didn't feel able to, including Scotland. We do have one remaining coal mine, and you'll be surprised to hear, you won't be surprised to hear, that the 100 or so people employed at that mine are raising serious issues about the Welsh government joining that, and there is a debate going on about, I understand the license for mining there is up for renewal either next year or the year after. But it was mainly, that agreement was mainly about new exploration. And there have always been suggestions that there might be a lot of oil under the Celtic Sea between Wales and Ireland. And the Welsh government is now committed that it will not, you know, if it's discovered, it will stay in the ground if it's in the Welsh territorial waters. So although in one way it's a theoretical commitment, except for those 100 people employed at Aberpergwm, it could turn out to be a very real and costly commitment. You know, who knows when. So we're quietly proud in Wales that our government was one of the 10. The other 9 also were ones who don't have substantial current oil and gas exploration, it has to be said. But I think Stephen will confirm that the Scottish government has indicated it may become what's called an associate member, which is a bit like the agreement on coal. It would be an agreement to phase down and not to do new exploration. So Scotland may be on that journey. Wales already is.
I think this actually raises something too that we've discussed in Climate Sunday, of the real importance potentially of the national assemblies, if I can call them that, other than the Westminster Parliament, although different ones have different powers, the moral and sometimes the practical leverage that they have is absolutely increasing. And as we campaign in the UK, we have to get more savvy at making the best of these devolved. I mean, this is not new, but we see it coming to the fore now around things like fossil fuel extraction. A discussion for another day, but fascinating and important to get our heads around. You know, now if you're not in England, you would have got your heads around this long ago. But the English particularly need to wake up to this. I think, you know, he speaks as an Australia England, but yeah, you get the idea. Okay. Are there opportunities, says Stuart, to have Climate Sunday across the world to demonstrate global solidarity on climate change? Who wants to give an answer to that one? Miranda, can I bring you in here?
Sure. So I think that's a great idea, Stuart. It's one of those things which would be absolutely fantastic to make happen. And the question would be how you kind of make it happen logistically. But on an encouraging side, when we were working towards Paris in COP21, we did bring together a coalition, Pray for COP21, which did include people and organizations that came in from other continents. So I don't think it's something that we as a steering group right now can say, yes, absolutely, we'll take it forward and we'd commit to that. But I think it's a great idea to have out there and one that we can maybe discuss with other coalition partners.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm going to try to bring together, partly for time, to make sure we can get through as many questions as possible. I'm going to try to bring together two questions here. One is, from Les Parker, what do churches do to tell the government to actually take bold action? Remember, as Bill McKibben said, winning slowly is losing. We need to rapidly step up the pace. So that's the first question. The second one, then I'll come back to another one from someone else, is from Dave Gregory. Although Climate Sunday brought many groups together, local churches seem to be bombarded with lots of input on COP26. It would seem important to continue a shared approach to provide a greater focus for churches to engage with. Well, I think one is the answer to the other question. I think it is absolutely important we step up the pace. I absolutely agree with Bill McKinnon. You know, there was once a time when we said we may have time, but we don't have time anymore. We just have to get the right actions taken very rapidly by governments. And I do think it is so much easier for churches when there is a collective coalition which everybody can be a part of, asking them to do one thing rather than competing ideas. Those competing ideas might of themselves be perfectly good ideas, but what we were trying to do with Climate Sunday was to have something that all denominations and all Christian charities can sign up to, and ask them frankly to put their own branded ideas on the back burner for a year and get behind the one thing so that no church feels it's being competed over or whatever. I think we've seen Climate Sunday be reasonably successful in that, but we also know that you know, it hasn't been total. There have been all sorts of other things happening as well, even by members that are also members of Climate Sunday, and that's a shame. But that's life. And I think as we go forward, one of the discussions we have as the Climate Sunday Steering Committee, and also as the wider group of the Environmental Issues Network of churches together in Britain and Ireland, which is, if you like, the parent body for Climate Sunday. Climate Sunday is the baby of the Environmental Issues Network, and that goes on from year to year, and all of us here are members of that. I think that's a very important discussion for us to have at our next EIN meeting, is how can we get greater focus and discipline so that our churches that support the different charities and from different denominations don't feel competed over and are all able to work towards the same goal. And I think that's we need that more than ever right now with this very important year to put pressure on the UK government. I don't know if that's again my personal view. If others on the steering committee want to add to that, please do.
Auntie, can I say quickly, there's also a question from Elizabeth Welsh along the same lines. Well, the Churches Together organisations in the various nations and CTBI are constitutionally restricted to doing what their member churches ask them to do. So if you want these things to be done jointly, and I agree with everything you've said, Andy, and I want them to be done jointly too, ask your own church to ask for it to be done jointly. And similarly, if your support, I saw everyone on this call supports one or more of the Christian development agencies, ask them to do it jointly, because that's the way it will happen. If it's tried to be imposed from, as it were, the top, from people like me who work for Churches Together and CTBI, there will be resistance. I can tell you that now from long and bitter experience over many issues. We are constitutionally obliged to do what our members ask. So if you're involved with a member of any Churches Together organisation, ask. It'll make it more likely that we can go on doing this together.
It's really helpful, Gethin. Yeah. So can I come to a question by Elspeth Strachan now? There was an Earth Vigil going on throughout COP26. Is there anything similar planned for us as churches in Britain and Ireland? If not, I think it would be helpful. Who here knows more about the Earth Vigil? I confess I don't. Elspeth, do you know who was organising that? And if you could put that in the chat, in the Q&A, that would help us.
Andy, I think the Earth Vigil was organised primarily through the Quakers, and it was an interfaith focus that involved a lot more faith groups as well. So I know that it moved around the city, which is always better, harder to hit a moving target in terms of organised activities, in terms of COP26. So that was certainly something that was really quite exciting. A lot of the time outdoors activities as well, and people joining in other parts of the world as well. So it's something, certainly some of us have been linking with different organisations that were doing work during COP. It's something we can go back to this wider coalition and have a little bit of discussion about with some of the other next steps as well.
Okay, great, thanks. And then the next question, very interestingly, for a conservation organisation like a Russia is will what next include actions related to the biodiversity COP, COP15, to be held in April, May in Kunming in China? I have to be honest and say we have not discussed that as Climate Sunday. That's not been our focus. There will be, that's not to say we can't, I'm just being honest, we haven't mentioned that yet in our discussions. But I know that certain organisations that are members of the Environmental Issues Network, such as a Russia UK, as a conservation organisation, we are thinking with our wider family about what we do about COP15. But it's not been on the agenda so far as Climate Sunday, but I'm not adverse to others raising it, I'm just stating a fact. Okay. Separately, I imagine that most people on this call would agree that there is also a twin crisis of biodiversity, but the focus of Climate Sunday very clearly was on climate. Jean Leston, what would you say to someone who thinks COP26 was such a failure that it was hopeless to try and take action? How do you inspire them to keep up the fight? Jean, now if this is the Jean Leston I think it is, was actually very materially responsible for Climate Sunday in the first place. So Jean, I'm going to out you and thank you for prompting us to do this from your role in Operation Noah, but I'll then answer the question. Who would like to answer that one? What do we say to people?
I'll start off and say that one of the things that people were saying in both the blue zone and the green zone over and over again at COP was that everything we do matters. We talk as if there are, well, we know there are clear targets and we're trying for those targets. But the reality is that every ton of emissions averted makes a difference. Every degree or portion of a degree of warming that's averted makes a difference. So we can continue working towards the targets. We can call out where the targets need firming up. We can call out where countries' contributions need to be increased. We can call out where financial targets, because we haven't really talked that much about that, but that's also a key aspect, the finance for adaptation, particularly for countries that have done the least to cause climate change and are being the worst affected. All of these things we can call out where the big things need to happen. But at the same time, we can just be aware that every incremental bit of progress in our own lives, in the lives of our churches, in the lives of our communities, in the lives of our countries, as well as internationally, really matters. And that can give us the motivation to keep going with the twin track approach of working towards the big targets, but also working to make sure the incremental progress is made.
Thank you, Miranda. And folk, we are right up against the limit of time here. There are many questions left, but I think we'll be here till 8:30, and that's not fair if we take all of those. So please forgive me if we've not got to your question. I've tried to get as many in as I can. By all means, if we've not answered your question, do wing us an email, and we will attempt to answer that another way if it's that critical to you. What email can we suggest? The Climate Sunday one. Can somebody, Hannah, can you tell us what that is again?
It's hello@climatesunday.org, I believe.
hello@climatesunday.org. Thank you. That should, we can't promise you the most instant answer because we are all doing this above our day jobs, if you know what I mean. But we will try to get back, and there's some really important questions I'd love to be able to answer. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and thank you for your participation. We do come out of COP26 with hope, for those who wonder. The result is officially, as Hannah said, but there are handholds there that we can pull ourselves up further on. And I think we all believe it's kind of what happens next that is going to make the difference as to whether Glasgow is seen ultimately as a success or a failure. And I think there's everything to fight for, particularly in this next year. So anything we can do to raise these questions with our own politicians through regular emails or letters to MPs, inviting them to our churches to hear from us what we think, as well as, of course, fulfilling our own commitments that we've made. That's the best thing we can do. And we on our side, who in different ways represent many of you here from different denominations and nations in Britain and so on, we will also be thinking over the next month intensively about what officially we as Climate Sunday can offer as we come to the formal end of the campaign. But we always said we wanted to leave a legacy. So our thinking and our praying will be about how best to leave that legacy and tools and information that allows people to keep going in their own way. But of course, the Environmental Issues Network of churches together in Britain and Ireland doesn't end, that carries on. So within that forum, we will be talking about what do we do together next. Okay, so be reassured of that. It's just this particular initiative formally comes to an end in January after that closing seminar. Okay. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as we can on that. And God bless in what you are doing in your own churches between now and then. Thank you.